welcome everybody. So yeah, this particular talk is titled Perspectives on the City. And at a time when our movements in the city may never be the same again, we are all seeing our habitual movements restricted. New questions arise that the city must provide urgent answers to. As the next generation of designers and thinkers, we must engage with the social and urban inequalities COVID-19 has taught us we can no longer afford to ignore. How and who are our cities built by? Who do they serve? The time to question the city is now. I'm really excited to be inviting Jacqueline, Sumita and David to be speaking this evening, and I will introduce the speakers in turn. And the format of the evening will be that each guest speaker will give a 15-minute presentation where they will give a perspective of the city, they will show their work, and as an entire piece, it will form a basis for discussion. So there'll be time for questions, and we are hoping that some of the themes that the talks will bring out will raise questions about the city, raise questions relevant to the work going on at the university at the moment. And is relevant to all of us really, not as whether we're designers or just members of the city. And yeah, there'll be time for a discussion after that. So the first speaker that I'll be welcoming is Jacqueline Bleicher. So Jacqueline is the founding director of Global Urban Design, a community interest company specialising in urban design, master planning, transportation, planning and engagement. She is an urban designer, a master planner, placemaker, workshop facilitator, chartered architect and co-author of Our City. Jacqueline actively promotes global urban design principles, universal design and sustainable development practice in inclusive placemaking. She values the community as experts in co-designing places they want to live, work and play. Jacqueline, over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and everyone. Thank you all for attending. It's my pleasure to be with you this evening, and also thank you to my esteemed panelists. Okay, so I'm going to share with you my perspective of the city, and I'm going to confine it to England, specifically London, and I'm going to look at the city from a racial inequality or an ethnicity inequality perspective. So to provide you with a bit of historical context or background, I'm going to refer you to 4 documents. And the first document is the Royal Town Planning Institute report on ethnic minorities, which stated that the planning system in Britain had largely failed to address the needs of Black and minority communities. The report also stated that colorblind approach to planning policy and practice institutionalized indirect discrimination in planning. We also have 40 years of struggle by Humanity, and that document found that 1 in 10 Black and minority people lived in the worst 10% of neighborhoods, in contrast to just 1 in 30 for the white population. It also stated that Black and minority people are also 3 times more likely than the white population to be residing in the worst 1% of the spaces in terms of living environment. The 2016 Healing Equality and Human Rights Commission, Healing a Divided Britain, stated that an intersectional approach was needed to address the inequalities faced by people with multiple protected characteristics. And it advocated for a holistic strategy for spending to really secure long-term significant and sustainable change. And then finally, the 2017 Race in the Workplace McGrath-Smith review, which highlights that if BAME, Black and minority ethnic talent, is fully utilized, the economy in the UK could receive a $24 billion boost. So after that sort of overview, I want to share with you some barriers in Britain to realizing equitable cities, equitable places. And I'm going to highlight on 4 key areas. So resources, which includes financial resources. It also includes the ability to create plans for areas. It factors in land resources. So is there land available to deliver on targets? And it also speaks to human resources. Knowledge and education, shifting priorities, and the delivery model. So I'm going to revert back to the resources side of things and just draw your attention to a few key characteristics. So the budget for most government planning and development has fallen to been cut by about 50% from between 2010 to 2015-16. We also have from 2017, 61% of local planning authorities outside of London not having an up-to-date national planning policy framework plan. We also need to note that the number of planners working in the public sector for full-time or private or part-time rather, has decreased from 70% in 2006 to 51% in 2020. And we also need to note that as of 2020 per RTPI data, the planning profession in the UK is 97% white, with only 3% of practitioners being Black, Asian, or minority ethnic. Now, why this is important to note is because, as mentioned, the needs of ethnoculturally diverse communities are not being met by the planning system. To also provide a wider professional perspective, the number of architects in public sector has also fallen to less than 10% in the last 30 years. And architecture is also a predominantly white profession at 84%. It's only 10% BAME, 6% undeclared, and of the BAME architects, 6% are Asian, 2% are mixed heritage, and 1% are Black. So again, we really need to look at how we are planning, who we are planning for, and who's doing the planning. On the point of knowledge and education, it's really important to note that many planning schools don't actually teach their students about design. And that is a critical deficit, because the correlation between spatial planning, the form and shape of the built environment for health and well-being, longevity, equality, economic empowerment for all UK residents and citizens is a fundamental thing to know when you are developing policy. So how does that policy actually look on the ground? That's something that planners need to understand. We have shifting priorities. Just to give an example with regards to sustainability, we have scrapped the zero carbon homes plan in 2016. It's supposed to come back in 2025, but in the interim, we are seeing homes being built not to the standard that will cost billions to the UK government to retrofit in years to come. And finally, the most important thing is our current delivery model. So our delivery model relies on planning gain to secure public good services, amenities, affordable homes, as well as social housing. Unfortunately, our planners aren't well equipped to negotiate with developers. They also aren't equipped to challenge viability reports. So it's really not a level playing field. And unfortunately, we are having communities being on the losing end of compromises that planning departments are making. So now that we've sort of established the context, where are we now? Well, right now, Britain is an unequal country. Through the lens of the indices of multiple deprivation, and here they are. And London is an unequal city. So this is a caption of the barriers to housing and services. And as you can see, the darkest blue areas are the areas that are most deprived. We have a blowout referencing the Dr. Cheshire Lives on the Line research, which actually maps along the tube line, so Central Line, Northern Line, etc., the difference in longevity from one London resident to another. So to give an example, a resident in Lancaster Gate can expect to live for 6 years longer than a resident in Mile End. Okay, so another example of inequality, and this relates to green space inequality for Black and Asian communities. And again, this is referencing research by Dr. Bridget Nathan-Peters, and she is referring to the CABE report of 2010, Urban Green Nation. And essentially what that is telling us is that almost 40% of people of Afro-Caribbean and Asian heritage are more likely to live in urban areas with a deficiency of access in green space, compared to just 14% for white counterparts. That means that people of color need to travel further to access green space that may be of lower quality, smaller size, and not necessarily designed for their needs or address their preferences. And here we are with COVID-19. And that has just served to exacerbate all of the different inequalities in society, especially education, employment, healthcare services, access to green space. In fact, we saw that under the coronavirus regulations, police were fining people of Black and minority ethnic heritage on average 1.6 times more than their white counterparts when accessing green space, which is known to be important to mental health. And in some areas, fines were dispensed at a rate of 6 times higher when compared to white counterparts. We also saw in 2020 the murder of George Floyd, which by an unarmed Black man by police in custody. And that event catalyzed global events. So we saw people all over the world come together, Black and white, young and old, essentially demanding an end to racism and structural and systemic discrimination. So now that we've established context, what's the way forward? And I'm going to propose defining for ourselves sustainable development, and you may have your own definition of sustainable development. And this is adapted from an image by Conserve Energy Future. So essentially, if we look at reframing our economic policy towards a green economy, we need to consider low carbon growth. So again, net zero housing, buildings, also resource efficiency. And in the context of the built environment, that would include resource efficiency. It would include whole life cycle costing for the building. It would include decommissioning, reuse and recycling of materials. And primarily, it also includes social inclusivity so that we actually balance the needs of all members of society, irrespective of their skin color. And that would give a definition of sustainable development. So why is this important? In the context of London, we're looking at evolving communities. So this map is from 2015, and it shows the distribution of Black and minority ethnic populations across London. And if we look at the darkest blue areas, those are concentrations of over 60% multi-ethnic populations. And then in the lightest blue areas, so here in Richmond, you can see that it's 5% and below. Now, why is this so important? It's important because 8 out of 10 of the most diverse boroughs are in London. And per GLA estimates for 2020, on average, London is 61.8% multi-ethnic. Now, 40% of Londoners of working age population are Black and Asian minority ethnic. So when we are visioning our city and designing, we really do need to consider everyone. And as it is now, these communities are being underserved and often targeted with regards to regeneration instead of revitalization. So we need to really look at how we can do better in terms of our planning and creating equitable spaces and equitable places and equitable cities for all. Okay, so this is a reference to our own work. So Global Urban Design collaborated with C8 Simple Design as well as 100% Plus over the first lockdown in March. And we surveyed our respective networks to learn lessons from COVID-19 and lockdown. We asked people what do they need from their homes and also what they needed from their neighborhoods. And so we got over 150 respondents, primarily in the UK, primarily in London, of mixed ethnicities, so women, Black women, white women, and Black men and white men. And in no particular order, people were asking for space accommodation internally, so home offices, storage. They wanted outdoor space, whether that was a private balcony or terrace, as well as secure bike parking. And then in their neighborhoods, they were asking for wider sidewalks, bike lanes, parks within 5 to 10 minutes walk, access to delivery services, and again, shops serving healthy food within 5 to 10 minutes walk. So we actually took those findings and we developed 6 principles for future communities that could be applied across the UK for new greenfield sites, for brownfield sites, for redevelopment. And those 6 principles are community-led, social, affordable, and mixed tenure, COVID-19, safe, healthy homes and well buildings, sustainable development and retrofitting, climate change sensitivity, urban greening, habitat and biodiversity protection, and 10-minute complete livable neighborhoods. So in the context of our own work, we applied those principles to a brownfield site in London. We chose Old Kent Road in Southwark, and we actually looked at the existing site. So just to orient you, we've got a recycling plant, and we chose this as the focus because, again, as we move away from plastics, there are innovations with regards to plastic replacements that include cassava, potatoes, pea protein. There's also research being done on algae. And then there's also a move, especially post, during lockdown, to growing more green. So we're expecting a lot more composting. And the site also includes some industrial uses, some big box stores, so retail stores. There's an existing school and housing and industrial sort of recording studios, so creative areas as well, and primary school on here. And that's a picture of the recycling plant as well as decommissioned gas works, which you see there. Okay, so to adapt the principles to the site, one of the key things we wanted to do, again, so making it 10-minute, walkable and mixed use, we incorporated a number of the uses that existed on the previous site in the proposed development. So again, you have your industrial uses, your office studios, your co-working, your maker spaces. You have your retail, which we were asked to provide, so the big box stores. You also have independent retail. You have the community spaces, so there's a community center, community co-working space, as well as a health center. The level of density triggered a secondary school. We also factored in the multicultural heritage in terms of a cultural center, a multi-faith center in the development, and we retained the recording studios and the storage industrial areas, and also allowed for expansion of the existing primary school. The council had Bakerloo line extension, so we put that in as well, and we preserved the grade 2 listed gasworks as well as other buildings there. But the key point is that the entire development is 10 minutes walkable. So you have everything that you need for daily life within 10 minutes walk, and 5 minutes walk from either end of the development. From wherever you are, you're within walking distance of a major green space, which is something that we found from our respondents they really, really needed. So again, just to illustrate the principles, so the community led in terms of the sharing economy and no one left behind. The community owned and managed assets, so the playing area, the sports field, the community center are there, the social, affordable and mixed tenure. That is salt and peppered throughout. So there's no one building that's going to be classed as the social housing or the affordable housing. It is integrated within, so there are no poor doors. You can't look at a building and see. It's also mixed tenure because that allows for people to age in place. You have accommodation for students, you have accommodation for pensioners, starter families. As people go through the various stages of life, they can continue to stay in the place where they know and they love. We also have provisions for COVID-safe homes and well buildings, so natural daylight, it's dual aspect. We've also improved on the space standards, so it's a bit more generous than the minimum safe standards that we have in the UK, which is quite minimal. And we've also provided, flexible space based on what people were asking for. So just to illustrate some of those principles in the main area, so you're sort of seeing the kind of main space, which is a mix of green space where children can play. You can sort of sit and read. There's shade, varieties of types of seating. You've got umbrellas, you can have lunch. And what's important to point out about this in terms of inclusivity and accessibility is that there are so many different uses within the area that are overlooking the space, that people have different reasons to be there at different times of day. And that means that you get a diverse range of people. And that builds tolerance and trust, because if you get used to seeing people over time who are different from you, you start to be more comfortable in public space. And that was something that was mentioned. People mentioned that they wanted to feel safe. They needed to feel safe in public space, which tended to be hostile for ethnoculturally diverse people. So something to note there. We also had the other three principles: so sustainable development and retrofitting, climate change sensitivity, and the 10-minute complete livable neighborhood. So in terms of the sustainability, we tried to make sure that we had the solar panels on the buildings. We've got green roofs, terraces. You have opportunities to plant on your roof deck if you want to have urban agriculture. We also included community gardens so that you can grow food here. You've got the play space. With regards to climate change sensitivity, again, we mentioned the green walls, the green roof, recycling, rainwater harvesting for the fountains, really trying to make it as green as possible. And then in terms of the complete neighborhoods, you've got access to shops. We tried to have little corner shops in dotted throughout. So even if you're in on the ground floor and above, you've got loads of housing, you can just go downstairs and be right there at a greengrocer's if you needed one. So there's access to services. We have the health center here, the community center. There's a school. The Bakerloo station is right there. There's also cycle paths. You've got sidewalks. You've got electric vehicle charging points in there, and then street furniture, rest and pause areas. And the next slide will actually illustrate some of that a little bit better. So this is the community garden area. You've got your sort of community garden center. Again, people can come out, spend some time, sit. It's wide open. It's very easy to see and be seen. Again, an important criteria for safety. We've got the tree-lined streets. You've got the seating so people can go for a stroll, take a sort of stop, sit, read on a bench if they wanted to do that. And that's the area that we are looking at. So just to sort of sum up in terms of what we did, again, it was a speculative design for a competition. It is mixed use. We actually have ground floor area of 781,000 square meters, so 39.68 hectares. You can see better on this the orientation for the solar panels. So it's really well aligned to capture the sun for the solar, but you also have shaded streets as well, so it's comfortable to be out and about in public space. And the urban design principles we utilized included walkability. So again, you can sort of see that it's quite accessible. It's 5 minutes. So from here to here, you can walk that in 5 minutes. You have that continuity and enclosure. So along the street, you are within a space. You can also change your mind if you want to walk down this way or walk down that way. You've got character and variety as well as adaptability and robustness. So some of these are two-story spaces in there as well. So we try to really listen to the research and also what people need from multicultural communities. So that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of our presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. I'm going to now hand over to the next presenter, architect Simita. Thank you for your time and your attention.
That was fascinating. Really enjoyed that. I'm going to hand over now to Sumita Singha. Sumita is an award-winning architect, academic, and author with her own design practice, Ecologic. Sumita's awards include the UIA UNESCO International Design Award, Women in Business Award, and Atkins Inspire Award. She's been teaching in architecture for over 25 years in the UK and abroad. Sumita set up Architects for Change, the Equality Forum, and REBA, at RIBA and is past chair of Women in Architecture and has served on a large number of RIBA committees for over 25 years. Sumitra is also the founding director of Kashula, an international design charity and for community project, and is the author of several books, including Orchidelic Architect, Women in Architecture and Future Healthcare Design. Sumitra, I will pass over to you now.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So thank you very much, James and Lucia, for inviting me to speak on this important subject, perspectives in the city. You raise an excellent point that with you as the next generation of designers and thinkers, we must engage with the social and urban inequalities that COVID-19 has taught us, and we can no longer afford to ignore it. So this is of special interest to me as I work across design, urban food security, third sectors, and healthcare on the common base of sustainable development and with a people-centered approach. I'm also a non-executive in the NHS, and through the last year, I've had an insider perspective on the management of the COVID pandemic. I'm also a co-founder of the CECOL group, which looks at NHS leadership among the non-white people, NEDs especially, and I'm a member of the Disabled Directors Networks in the NHS. Such memberships have given me an insight into the unequal impact of the pandemic on the most vulnerable people in society. So in this slide, you can see that, my work through sort of about 30 years. So I had a master's in sustainable design about 30 years ago. And I remember people used to ask me, so what is it that you exactly studied? And nobody was kind of thinking about sustainable design then. So the work I've undertaken include homes, offices, community centers, medical centers, urban design, and also work with non-conventional materials such as earth and straw. So this, in the next slide, you will see some of my publications which have resulted from practice-based research. So, from lecturing. So 10 years ago, I wrote a book on the holistic development that included nature and climate in my first book, Architecture for Rapid Change and Scarce Resources. Now it is in its second reprint, and it has been adopted for design professionals in the US. My second book, Autotelic Architect, which has also been reprinted, I say that the duties of the architect should include climate design, because what was merely a change in 1970s has turned into a full-blown crisis, only because of ignorance, interference, greed, and apathy. So as James said, I founded Architects for Change, the Equality Forum at the RIBA, and was past chair of Women in Architecture. Hence, my writing and lecturing has also included discourses on diversity and inclusion, as in this 4-volume publication, Women in Architecture. My book on future healthcare design was actually published just at the beginning of last year, just before we had the lockdown. I had no idea we'd have this pandemic then, so it was quite interesting. And then at the end of 2020, I was asked to write another book, this time with some other people looking at the post-pandemic work. And this is the last book that you see, which is called Rethink. So if you go to the next slide, which is about climate justice, you can see that no one, if you look at the large map, you can see that no one can actually self-isolate from the climate crisis that's coming on. And you will see on your right, the people that haven't actually contributed to the crisis will be the most affected. So if you look at the annual carbon dioxide emissions, which is the bottom map on the right, you get a picture of the countries that are emitting the most carbon dioxide. But then if you look at the per capita, which is the one on the top of that, you see a very different picture emerging. So you'll find that the rich countries are actually emitting more of the carbon dioxide than the other countries such as India. So what's happening is that this issue is going to spread all over the world. and we're all going to be affected. And according to experts, the climate crisis will be the equivalent of a COVID crisis every year, starting from the middle of this century. So it won't be a one-off event like COVID. And of course, COVID, as we know, is the result of our interference with nature. So there is a moral imperative on architects, because we contribute to about 40% of carbon emissions through building activities, to make our designs more climate friendly, inclusive and sustainable. So how do we get there? So I was looking at the cognitive bias in my next slide. And I believe that there are 3 reasons and 3 levels on which we experience this bias. So one is the personal and societal and environmental. So on a personal level, first, we have very short-term memories and visions, perhaps extending to about 3 generations after us. No one will remember the lessons of the 1918 pandemic, and most probably the lessons of COVID-19 will be forgotten in 100 years' time. Secondly, despite the internet and the social media, we still see what we want to see. So we filter out things, or the algorithm does it for us. And thirdly, most importantly, we're hardwired to waste as a sort of species. So I've seen mountains of oyster shells in a deserted beach in Mexico left by people over thousands of years. Small hills of waste glass bottles in Cornwall left behind by Victorians. And now, of course, you see people throwing things out of their cars. There were 1 million incidents of fly tipping in 2019 alone. We're even polluting the space surrounding our beautiful planet with 1,062,000 man-made objects circling it. So the only difference between pre-industrial and post-industrial times is what we throw out now is not biodegradable or usable. On a societal level, we believe that somehow institutions and economy and technology will save us. We believe that we believe very strongly in the linearity of progress. So we've come this far, we can't go back. But actually the COVID crisis has shown that we can go back. And of course, the inequality in the world shows us that we haven't actually progressed that much. The inequalities between people have actually been increasing. Everything in nature works in cycles and in phases of growth and decline, yet we design systems that are linear, not cycles, that work in cycles. On a larger environmental level, we believe that nature is benevolent and it will protect us. In reality, nature is neutral and holds the ultimate power. It is up to us to work with it. COVID and other zoonotic diseases are the result of human interference with nature. So what is happening with our cities? So if we look at the first concept, which is, in the cholera epidemic of 20th century London, when after an infected water pump was closed and the spread of the disease also stopped, airborne diseases are much more difficult to stop. The role of urban design and densities and disease transmission has been debated during the COVID-19 pandemic. It became evident that low-income sections of the population were more vulnerable than others, even in one single country. Being unable to afford good quality food, living in polluted areas or crowded housing, or suffering from comorbidities made one vulnerable to disease. So the fact that these biases have been revealed through the COVID is actually perhaps a good thing, and perhaps a good thing for architects and educators to start or rethink on how they start teaching and working within cities. So we've spent now more than a year living with the consequences of such urban planning. So I want to put before you 3 main challenges to discuss later. And these 3 key elements are not only true for cities, but they're also true for countries and also across the globe. And most importantly, that these 3 things are interrelated. So the first is about the lonely city. So we realized that people make cities and thrive through connections. Our brains and bodies are set up to connect socially, have been set up to connect socially for millennia. As city dwellers, we depend upon each other for many things essential for day-to-day living, such as shopping, working, teaching, etc. As Desmond Morris said, cities are not concrete jungles, they are human zoos. We like to work in social circles that also correspond with how far we can walk, and a sort of which is called the Dunbar figure of 150 people. That's like a small village. We like to, so the research during the pandemic from PricewaterhouseCoopers showed that even through the pandemic, local demand was actually resilient, with fewer people willing to travel more than 5 kilometers to visit high streets. The concept of the 15-minute city, and also what Jacqueline spoke about earlier, is not new, but as our cities have expanded, services are no longer local. So we're having to go back to this concept again. So on the left of this slide, we see new developments that are coming up. They're hardly recognizable or connected to the place that they sit on. One is in West London, near where I live, and the other, unbelievably, is in Melina. And if you can see that there's like not much difference between the two, and such developments are coming up all over the globe, it's not surprising that we're actually lonelier than ever. With multi-story flat living and the consequences of COVID lockdown, enforced separation has increased stress and mental health issues. A fifth of Britons say that they're living alone during lockdown. People even died alone in their homes during COVID in the UK, lying undiscovered for 2 weeks. In Japan, which has a large older population, there is now a minister for loneliness. In some ways, despite living in flats, our independence has also made us lonely, and technology has enabled this independence, and which has also increased our loneliness. So my question is, how can we design cities that foster connections and engagement? So on the right are some of the design development work I've carried out. These involve working in small groups of people, looking at design ideas and selecting those that the community most likely take ownership of. So I'm giving away my ownership as an architect to the project, to the community to take forward. So this project on the top is one from Ealing in West London. And the one on the bottom is one from Caracas in Venezuela. And the other one with a large group of people to the extreme right is from Palestine. So what we also have is a deprivation issue. And we discovered that during COVID-19, inequalities didn't just appear from nowhere, but they have built up over time. And most people died from COVID that lived in the deprived areas such as Blackburn, which was the worst hit. This extends to other diseases too. A recent study of 100,000 people in Wales showed that asthmatics living in more deprived areas were far more likely admitted to hospital and die from their illness than those living in the prosperous areas. Sorry, the slide shows stop. So these are the English deprivation scores here, and I've just transferred that into a pie chart. And if you look at it, the financial or the monetary aspect of it are the two, which is the income and the employment. All the others, the living environment, the barriers to housing and services, crime, education, health, are either connected with where we live or the services which we get from the government. So in a way, you know, there's a lot architects can do to actually help in more than half. Actually, it's more than half of this pie chart that we've got responsibilities for. So if you look at the next slide, which is about unequal cities, we find that deprivation indices are not, if they're adjusted for local factors, if you look at the chart on the extreme left on the top, you see that the English deprivation indices are actually, if you look at the local ones and convert them to local ones, they were quite different. So the map on the extreme left looks very different from the map on the right of that same map. And this is a study that's ongoing. So you can see that even within cities, different localities will have different inequalities. So, and then if you look at the bottom on the left, you'll see a city like Caracas, which you can see the inequalities so blatantly, you know, with the shanty town on one side and the nice built up areas on the other side, designed by well-known architects. And then if you take, you know, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you'll see on the bottom right, you'll see countries which are struggling to actually contain actually progress because they haven't got either the means or the money or the knowledge to have sustainable development. So you can see, for example, large part of Africa, which is like lagging behind. But it doesn't mean that you know, everybody in Africa is living in poverty. If you were to do the same thing as you did for the Manchester, you'll probably find pockets of wealth and then pockets of poverty within each country and within each region. So I asked that, you know, for example, the tragedy of Grenfell revealed economic and health inequalities. Across the Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea, life expectancy was the highest in the country. In parts of Knightsbridge, a man would expect to live up to 94, but in the poorer parts of the borough, so near Grenfell Tower, the average life expectancy for a man is 72. And this has been dropping since 2010. So one street in Knightsbridge has a 0% health deprivation rating, but one block on the council estate 2 miles away has a 65% health deprivation rating. So my question is, how do we create cities without inequalities? So these are 2 projects I did in Hoxton. So if we go back to the last slide, please. London on the top right, we work with people who are normally excluded from work and construction work and architectural design, such as people with physical and mental health issues. And then to the right, I show a workshop we did with people across the state, again, in a very deprived area of Hackney, to enhance a sense of community and participation. So in the next slide, we see unhealthy cities and how did that develop. So basically, the world is urbanizing very quickly. According to the UN, the world would be 60% urbanized in 15 years' time. By 2030. So cities in Asia, in South America in particular, are expanding rapidly with mega cities located there. According to experts, the climate crisis, as you know, will affect cities more than rural areas. But what is happening is that when the Lancet examined health and climate change with data from 9 countries, they account for 70% of the world's emission. It found that if these countries were to be on track to keep with the global heating threshold set by the Paris Accord, about 6 million lives could be saved due to better diet. Over 1 million lives could be saved due to cleaner air, and over 1 million lives to increasing exercise. And this is again a part of healthy living. But what you're seeing essentially is cities being separated from nature. This is a city called Manaus, which is in the Amazonas part of Brazil. And you can see how clearly the road is dividing the Amazon forest from the city. But unfortunately, the Amazon forest in this part is exactly where we think that the next pandemic is going to come from in about 4 years' time, and we're not prepared for it. So another research led by Harvard University in collaboration with UK University showed that more than 8 million people around the world were dying as a result of breathing polluted air. And this is also affecting the forests and it's affecting, you can't contain air. So it's like floating around everywhere around the globe. So how do we exist harmoniously with nature despite living in cities? So one way is bringing nature into cities as much as we can, educating the next generation about nature. So this first project that you see on the right at the top was a project I undertook with people in Caracas. And here you see young children who are actually talking to an ecologist and learning about plants and the medicinal effect of some of the plants. They didn't know, they didn't realize where their food comes from. So this was a very important project. We actually also did a gardening project, kitchen garden project on that very site that these girls are sitting on. And the second project, which you see at the bottom, is actually a community kitchen garden, which we are still working on. It is on a station platform. So anywhere that you can find space can be an area where you grow plants and educate people. And this is where we've grown vegetables and herbs, and people are welcome to get off from trains, take a bit of produce and go home with it. So it's, we're now working on a second phase of this project with the organizers. So I leave you with this question, these 3 questions, and hopefully in the question and answer session, we can discuss a bit more on this. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Samita. Really enjoyed that presentation. And next we have David. So David Odmuiwa runs architecture and urban design practice, Architecture Doing Place, which specializes in social housing and arts projects. He's an expert on delivery of regeneration in deprived environments with diverse stakeholders. David has worked as a housing officer for social landlords, including Lambeth, Southwark, Tower Hamlets, and Circle 33, before retraining as an architect. David combines practice with teaching architecture at a number of universities and mentoring schemes, including public practice, the Royal College of Arts. David has been an advocate for diverse authorship and publicly funded projects, and holds a number of strategic advisory positions, including as a mayor's design advocate, contributing to London-wide policy and housing development. David is the last speaker, and I invite him to speak next.
Great, thank you, James. It's great following Samita and Jacqueline, and thank you for their presentation. It's really interesting because when I first saw those, I thought our presentation might seem a bit frivolous, filled with visualizations and such, but just bear with me because they do bear a kind of, they're indicative of our approach to some of the same themes. So it'd be really interesting to, really looking forward to the conversation afterwards. As James has said, I run a practice called Architecture Doing Place, and we focus on social housing and arts projects. But what's really interesting is how what we try and be about and talk about and demonstrate is an idea of equity in cities, where I'm a confirmed urbanist. I'm very proud to say that. I'm really, I'm very interested in cities. I'm interested in what cities can do and how we fit into them as people. Also, I think it's kind of, our approach is indicative of a kind of pragmatic lens, looking at the current kind of structural systems and local and governmental systems and institutional systems, trying to see how we can hack that, trying to see how we can influence or change that, trying to see how we can hold that to account, but ultimately also trying to see how we can make systemic change and create some of the outcomes that we're really interested in, which, by the way, most of the people from all spectrums of architecture always tell us they're interested in, and clients as well. So it is interesting that quite often we don't see the outcomes of those, but everybody involved in the process is interested in these outcomes. So that's something I want to touch on. We often talk about how our just bear with me. There we go. How our shared built environment forms all of us inescapably, and in this way as a form of franchise. And by franchise, I mean equivalent to everybody getting the vote after a kind of particular age of majority. And the point of that is you wouldn't dream about taking away anybody's right to vote, or I mean, you know, that would be a very controversial thing to do at the moment. Yet, routinely, people's opportunity to influence authorship that defines their lives is really kind of circumscribed. So one of the points I make is that the people that are invited to design a shared built environment are not very different now than they were by and large 100 years ago after the First World War. And that's really intriguing, as bearing in mind some of the statistics that Jacqueline said earlier on. Actually, the statistic I often use on that is one that's now 10 years old, which is from the last census, which said that London is 47.3% diverse. James, are you about to?
David, I was just going to say, you might want to hide your screen so that the audio is just crackling a little bit. So you might want to turn your screen off.
Apologies.
I turn the the video off, and then it might sound better.
Let me just stop sharing for a moment and then reshare. Just bear with me a second.
That's all right. Yeah, and then I think that should work better. And I think we could do a full screen maybe, so that get it over the whole screen.
Great, absolutely. Yeah. Let's have a go at that. Just coming up.
Yeah, that's fine, David. You can carry on.
Yeah, you can see it. It's
yeah, we can see it.
It's gone to sleep a bit.
Better as well.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Okay. All right. So the images might be really slow. So this image is really interesting because on the right-hand side of the page, that's me with the baseball cap on behind the RIBA Award. So this was an estate in Brixton called Angeltown Estate. This photo was taken in, I think, about 2003. What's interesting about this is I was a housing officer on the estate next door, which is Loughborough Junction in Lambeth, in the middle of Brixton. And the way I got into architecture was by, on my lunch break, I was studying part-time 1 day a week at South Bank University on a architecture part one. And I just asked if I can be involved, and they asked me to go and speak to all the 5 teams. There were 5 teams on the estate regeneration, and they asked me to go and speak to all of them. They all offered me a job, and I got into architectural practice. That was in 1999. That's how comes I happen to be here, sat in front of you, talking now. The interesting thing about that is that shouldn't be a rare journey. That should be a regular journey. It shouldn't just be one of me. There should be 200 of me, 300 of me, because it's not as if there is a lack of regeneration processes happening. And since the expansion of university education in 1992, but even frankly prior to that, but certainly in 1992, there has been a lot of people who have had some form of architectural training who could contribute to these processes. Now, what that effectively means is that if regeneration is coming from public processes, without including all of the people that it has an effect on their lives, then it's effectively a regressive redistribution of wealth. And that's how I talk about it. So this is a kind of economic implication, whilst people are very often talking about things like social value and regeneration and various other synonyms and euphemisms for essentially the same process. So the idea is supposed to be that you're supposed to kind of create a kind of economic benefit and dividend and access to prosperity from putting in all this effort and time and resource and treasure and energy. What tends to happen is that money doesn't trickle down. The people that are invited to be part of that process, quite apart from design consequences, the people that are invited to be part of that process are people who are typically already part of that process and are already kind of benefiting from that. And by the way, I'm not saying at this stage that people should be excluded from it. I think what I'm always talking about is not to change one group's privilege for another group's privilege, but to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to contribute. And that's all that we want. And from that, you get everybody benefiting from it. And another way to put that is it's not a kind of zero-sum game where if somebody else gets more slice of the pie, somebody else gets less slice of the pie. If you allow open access to everybody to these processes, because architecture is so systemic, it affects, and the amounts of money that go into it are so systemic, they have a massive impact if they spread out through local economies, through opportunities for people to get employment. if you allow this, you just allow more people to bring their pies, for want of a better words, to the thing. So you simply have more pies, you simply have more prosperity. And that's, rather than putting separate pots of money into a basket that says, help these people, and seeing people as needy or takers, you allow people to participate, to bring their productive capacity. That has a dividend in terms of well-being, in terms of use, in terms of people being able to feel like they've got a real stake, rather than them just being at the end of the process and then being told that this is what you're getting, and please sign off on this, which is how these processes happen to work. Now, what's the consequence of this? The consequence of this is several, but one of the consequences is you get conversations about them and us. You get a lot of suspicion that's impacted. You get conversations about gentrification. Another one of those things is you get a massive democratic lack of trust. So you end up with situations where people are saying, you end up with situations like we're all familiar with now, when people don't trust the authorities when they're talking about that, you need to have a vaccination that might save your life. People don't actually trust that because those processes haven't typically been beyond reproach. They haven't always been scrupulous or careful. There may be now, there might be good intentions there. And I must say this as well. I often find all of the people I meet in this are very open to this. They're very well intentioned, but quite often they rely on upstream processes and systems that are themselves specifically exclusive and frankly designed to be so, in some of the ways that both Jacqueline and Samita have demonstrated earlier on. So how do we break this cycle and change this? So this image is really interesting because this is an image we had for a competition that we were shortlisted for the London Festival of Architecture, and they asked us for a team photo. We didn't have to collaborate on this team, but we really wanted to bring a lot of people along with us because of my own personal credentials that are entirely accidental in many ways. I have got an opportunity to kind of have these conversations and be in rooms with people. So I often get some of, not as often as people think, but I get a bit more than my colleagues opportunities to have these conversations. So I wanted to make opportunity for other teams. So this is Westport and Company, Mary Evans, who's a fine artist, and Zainab from Right Talk Listen, who are cultural curators. And we wanted to have this image in the Architects Journal to demonstrate our team. Now, we were really itchy. We were really hoping somebody would point out that this team is entirely diverse and there were no white faces in it. And the reason we wanted to do that was because we wanted to have a dialogue about the, frankly, weeks and weeks and weeks and years and years and years when there are pictures all the time when there's not a single black face in that journal or other journals. So it's a really important thing about a kind of set of conversations that we have, which is about there are things that are just in front of people's eyes and faces that people look right through. So they're all of the kind of procurement officers for local governments. There are 33 London boroughs, and it was really interesting looking at Jacqueline's set of maps about where the biggest deprivations are. Procurement officers from those London boroughs go from their commute to their offices, walking past people very diverse. They look out their window, they see people at the front desk that are diverse, and then they go into their office and they employ people that never look diverse. And this wasn't for what, so in 2016, I did a set of freedom information requests, 66 in total, to the 21 most diverse London councils and Birmingham City Council, asking them a simple question of when did they last employ an architect that frankly looked anything like Stephen Lawrence, even though they had a pot of money and every year they would do comms and presentations around Stephen Lawrence Day. It didn't seem to connect to them that they didn't hire anyone that looked like Stephen Lawrence. So Hackney Council, for instance, and I'm very happy to call them out on this, who is statistically the most woke borough, according to the last elections, in quote unquote, in the United Kingdom, hasn't employed anybody that looks like Stephen Lawrence to design as much as a park bench in over 30 years. Or at least, and I can prove that up to about 20 years through freedom of information requests. And this is in the context of Black Lives Matter, and before that, and various other conversations and regular riots. And they don't seem to understand that there's a link between, things that you do and where you spend your money and outcomes, which it seems to me really perverse, a really perverse way of looking at the world. But there are other local authorities that are really good. I'm just going to fly through some kind of pretty pictures now really quickly for some of our projects, and I'll kind of name check the good clients that we found that do believe in this, that have never needed to be pulled and screened. So this is an installation we did dealing with the idea of this kind of institutional memory at the Tate Britain a few years ago. where we had to design a traveling exhibition. We had to make a kind of playful out of cardboard that allowed families to come together and allowed people to kind of establish conversations around these things. Just really quickly, because I'm conscious of time. Brick Lane, I just wanted to come to this quickly. So this is London Borough of Tower Hamlets, who we have found, and actually historically, so they commissioned David Adjaye for the Idea Store. David commissioned architects that we like of colour, that we like and respect, like Shahid Salem from Makespace in Tower Hamlets, and Jaden Ali in Tower Hamlets. But that is almost unique in London. And that culminated last year, as many of you will know, in Southwark Council. And so it's really interesting that Jacqueline was showing the Old Kent Road. So I grew up in Southwark. I used to walk across that road to go to school. I have met, and just the other day, I interviewed a young Part 1 graduate who also grew up literally 500 meters away from where I grew up. So I have met about 5 architectural practitioners that have grown up about 500 meters away from my front door where I grew up. None of them have been included or invited to be involved in any of the processes, regeneration processes that are occurring in the middle of a historic housing crisis where councils have a lot of pressure to build housing supply. So that just shows you the kind of scale of the problem. This is a scheme that we did for Tower Hamlets. It was an infill scheme excuse me, there's an infill scheme on Brick Lane, which is kind of needs no explanation to anyone else. I really wanted to talk about this really quickly, which is something to do with one of the things that Jacqueline was saying. So whilst we talk about these processes, one of the things I also want to get clear is we don't have a monopoly on virtue. We're not right all the time. We don't know everything about everything. The point is we have a perspective, we have something to offer, and we have something to share. Now, there is an issue with the fact that councils, when they're trying to build new housing for everybody, don't have a lot of land. There is a scarcity of public land in cities from Rio de Janeiro to Johannesburg to Melbourne to New York to London. So that is just a thing. Public land is scarce in big cities. That's just a fact of life. So what happens when we need new social housing? So one of the things we try and deal with and respond to in our work is how you build on infill sites in and around estates that effectively mean, unfortunately, that sometimes you're densifying estates, you're closing off some open space, you're building on what is public space. This was a corner of a street that had become a kind of, it'd been closed off, it just become a visual amenity, and I don't know if you can see kind of in the background there, it just become an open bin store. So we suggested that could be better used to provide at least 4 new units of housing. And because we were also, another thing, interestingly, from what Sumita was saying, one of the things that we weren't as confident as we wanted to be was a kind of dealing with the climate emergency. So we wanted to start thinking about what could be a response to that is load bearing, that we could start to think about on a very small site for council housing. And we started to look at rammed earth. And this allowed us to kind of do a research project. This was up to feasibility stage. This is up to RIBA stage 2. We were commissioned by London Borough of Tower Hamlets, like I said. So not only are they kind of open-minded and thoughtful and proactive for their residents and for their constituencies in the kind of narrow sense of it, they're also looking at bigger schemes and they're also looking at kind of in terms of, not just in terms of diversity, I mean, but also in terms of other things that are kind of on the agenda at the moment. So they kind of supported us in looking at how we might try and use rammed earth for social housing. This was the first proposed UK social housing rammed earth scheme for a local authority. This is a scheme that we're currently engaged in at the moment. We're literally drawing this as we speak. Members of my staff are beavering away. It's on the banks of the Grand Union Canal. It's in a massively constrained estate at the moment in a conservation area. So there's the Canal and Rivers Trust Planning Authority and London Tower of Hamlets Planning Authority. The park that you see up there is Victoria Park, so it's a major London park. And we often joke that the only other place where you get a view of a historic body of water in a major London park is in Buckingham Palace, where you can see the Serpentine and Hyde Park. So it's, you know, it's got these kind of very particular issues around it. It's highly prescribed, I won't say anymore, by the planning department, and they've put some really onerous things, constraints on us. But we really wanted to kind of express this idea of a waterside urban fringe, which is what this part of London used to be. And there used to be a sawmill there, which used to have a chimney, and that's where those kind of tall points and those chimneys from, but they actually passively ventilate bin stores that are underneath. So they've got a use as well as being a kind of identity, kind of a marker, you know, a way of understanding it as a sense of identity, giving it belonging to the rest of the estate. Whilst we look at issues about kind of who's invited and who's not, we're really conscious that we also have some small privilege now. I mean, we begin to recognize we also have some small privilege now. So we try and extend that to other people who are also left out. So this is a site that we're doing in Bow for Tower Hamlets also, which is a quick feasibility study for a traveller site. Now, sadly, we were about the third architects that the council had come to because they'd spoken to other architects who declined to do it. And that was a bit chastening, actually, because we thought it was an amazing and really interesting typology and a really interesting thing to look at, because there's also a shortage of pitches, and there's a massive contention about where the spaces go. So on perspectives in the city, where do you put traveller sites, for instance? Where do you put traveller sites that make everybody happy? And that's a kind of ongoing thing. I might come back to that a bit more. We've proposed a set of additional pitches and a set of pitches that can incorporate a community centre there. This is a site as well that many of you may know, which is at the back of the Troxy music venue. So this is the Troxy music venue here. Commercial Road is over here, and this is the DLR viaduct that goes from Canary Wharf into Bank Station. And there is a this blue area here is a kind of service yard, a mechanics yard that's an essential part of the community. And we're actually collaborating with, I've forgotten, we're collaborating with Jackie's team here on this as our transport consultant. And we're coming along. We're putting a new, so that kind of red edifice there represents a kind of new social housing, 20 new units of 100% social housing. Now, this is where it gets contentious, because we come along to people and we say, we have to put this housing here because there's nowhere else for the council to put it. But obviously, that has an effect on the people who live in these units here, who are already in situ. Now, actually, it's directly south-facing, so you get a lot of light in there. But what we can try and do is negotiate that and make that process better, make that process more sensitive, make that process more open. So one of the things we started to think about was looking at mansion blocks. We started to look at the idea of the Richard Norman Shaw's Albert Hall mansions, right opposite Royal Albert Hall. Then we started looking at the materiality of terracotta, and we really like these kind of dwarf columns here. I don't know if you can see that. So we kind of use that as a motif. We also found that in the Peter Markley example here, somewhere in Germany from the early 80s. And we really kind of like that small kind of bit of expressiveness, but trying to build a kind of dense housing typology that would also fit into a context where there were issues about kind of neighborliness and conviviality. And we really wanted this kind of moment where we were kind of creating, this was one of our very early kind of concept sketches where we were talking about creating these communal areas where people could have a relationship with each other, but could also have their privacy. And it allows you to see how the light is penetrating straight south into the site, but also we've got these open deck access where you can see directly through. So that's a Troxy there, the back of the Troxy there. So you can see the sky through there. That kind of needle thing there, it came from a consultation. So we were talking to some residents. In fact, it was a week before the very first lockdown. And they were saying, well, it's a shame that you're gonna block our view of the viaduct, you're gonna block our view of the sky. So we started having this conversation about a periscope. So then we kind of showed the periscope. It's gone away now, but what it allowed us to do was to kind of establish a conversation and kind of demonstrate that we were responding to some of the issues that people were talking to us about, and what that might mean and what the cost of that might be. Because the reason that the needle went away was because it was too expensive, but actually we were able to start to talk about what that might mean. So if you had that needle, then you have less public realm intervention, you have a less of a kind of public realm, which we're still working with. But one of the other things we wanted was a kind of convivial space. And I grew up on deck access housing, and I know that if you have opaque barriers at deck access, it becomes a real problem, and that's where all the crime happens, because people are concealed and then you get dark and blind corners. So one of the small innovations we've tried to have is a kind of open kind of railing there so that you can see out and kind of try to express that aspect of it. But this is kind of the vision of what we're trying to lead on to, and we're still kind of working on this, was the DLR going past in the background. It's a really busy, this is on Cable Street, which is a famous historic street, very busy, really good transport links, zero parking, but hopefully more cycle space, more convivial areas where people can meet each other and talk to each other, but crucially new homes with what we call breakout and hustle space that respond to people, not just, so we started to talk about this before the pandemic, so not just more space internally in terms of net to gross that you can use to talk, you know, that you can use to kind of have more space internally and work from home, but actually space where you could use to establish a second income. So you might have a side hustle that you need some space that you might, you know, you might do somebody's nails, or you might make something, or you might be able to, you know, something that you could then sell somewhere else. Because we understand that some of these issues are about economic access to prosperity as well. And those are some of the issues we try and respond to later on. I'll just quickly whiz through this. This is a competition that we won in really quick, cheap competition that was 9 weeks from start to finish. This allowed us, this was in Portobello Pavilion, quite opposite the Tabernacle Art Centre in Notting Hill. It was £19,000 all told, including fees, including all the work, including all the payments that we gave to. So if you look at this picture below here, we hired local labour because we wanted to have a impact in terms of offering people, not just inviting people to talk about the opportunity, because I think lots of people do that now. There is an opportunity. There are lots of people who invite people to participate in terms of talking and giving their feedback on schemes. But that's still, the people who get paid and the people who don't get paid in regeneration teams is really stark. And it is an economic point of difference, frankly, and there's no real way around that. And I think councils should look closer at that, where their money goes and what it means. And if they just put a bit of it in a different pot, then they would get a much better and beneficial outcome. My alarm is telling me to shut up, so I can kind of whiz through these really quickly. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me and ask a bit more about these, I'm happy to talk about them. These are some good growth by design and policy things that I've been involved in recently, and that we continue to do and continue to advocate for outside of our day job. So I think I'll pass back to Lucia and James now, and thank you for being patient with me.
Thank you very much, David. That was fascinating. It was really nice to see all the images from your projects. Yes, so that is all of the presentations now. We have around 12-15 minutes for questions, and I'm sure there are some questions out there.
I have received the question in the chat from Idara, who sent it earlier on, and if she's still here, I will unmute her to ask. It was regarding Jacqueline's presentation, but I think it's a thread that has continued throughout all of the rest of the speakers as well. So if she's still there.
I am indeed. I'm quite happy for you to read the question as I've posed it. I'm sure that you'll.
Okay, will do.
Thank you.
Well, Idara was asking if Jacqueline would I be able to elaborate on the difference between development and regeneration? Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much, Idara, for asking that question. There is a difference. I think David in his presentation spoke a bit about the economic impact. So what I didn't actually say when I showed the slide on the distribution for communities in ethnically diverse communities in London, when you correlate that to the barriers to the housing slide that we saw, and also to areas that are earmarked for quote unquote regeneration by councils, those tend to overlap. So you're going to be impacting on primarily ethnoculturally diverse communities. And unless that is done sensitively, so that's why when we develop the principles, principle number 1 is sort of community-led, where we have elements of co-design, again, economic empowerment. So it's very much about leaving no one behind. The model that we have in the UK currently is failing communities, especially marginalized communities. It's failing in that we aren't able to realize the targets that we have for affordable housing. We aren't able to realize the targets that we have for social housing. We aren't able to provide the social amenities. So there is a difference in development for development's sake, and we often have development happening, and there are a number of examples. So we've got Nine Elms, we've got some of what's happened in Brixton, some of what's happening in sort of Elephant and Castle, where you are actually creating a vehicle for investment purposes. And so you have offshore investors who are parking money in real estate assets, who are absentee landlords. And with the Nine Elms example in particular, you were actually creating social apartheid. So you had very stark differences in terms of the amenities and the uses. And to quote from an article, I want to tell you it's the Observer, I'm not quite sure, but it is a newspaper article. They were actually quoting from a resident who purchased a 2-bedroom apartment valued at £800,000. It was part buy, so he had invested £200,000. However, he was relegated to sort of the back end of the entry, poor doors, couldn't access communal spaces, couldn't access amenities. And then they're seeing on the other side of the development where you got $1.5 million flats that on paper aren't actually intended to be lived in, but are sort of investment vehicles happening. So you can have development as a means of banking money, as a means of generating capital. We have in this country and again around the world uplift from planning permission. So you have speculative applications where there's absolutely no intention to develop on that piece of land. But once you have planning permission, that land suddenly goes up in value, and you can actually sell land with planning permission and reap the benefit of that uplift. So I'm speaking to you in sort of commercial terms about strictly development. And we have that happening, unfortunately, in London, and our councils seem to be helpless to prevent it. They're just not equipped to deal with developers. There's a whole industry around negotiating down Section 106 agreements. And what I mean by that are funds or pots of money that the council is requesting of developers to offset the impact of that development. So it can be whether it's more traffic, they might look to improve, to give an example, providing bike lanes, or they might provide maybe a sports hall or a recreation center, or it might be affordable homes, etc. However, developers employ people to actually negotiate down their Section 106 contribution, and that is an industry here in the UK. You also have viability assessments that demonstrate that the developer cannot possibly deliver on the council's targets for affordable homes while they still protect their 20% to 25% profit margin. And we have that happening. Where you have sort of kind of revitalization and even more community-led, so people actually start getting involved in their neighborhood local plans. They try and take over built assets for community use. There's also other models in terms of more sustainable development. So to reference Norwich Council, they did, and it's a RIBA award-winning development whereby they developed, I think, 100 units, about 7 blocks, 93 passive homes, but they actually acted as the developer, or rather the project manager, and they hired different architects and they hired contractors and things to build, and they were able to realize that with community space for about, I think, $1,850 per square meter for passive house standard. To give you other examples of alternate development models that are a bit more community-minded and community-focused, we have examples from Germany and Vienna, whereby the councils either retain the land that they have, which can be done here in the UK, especially with social housing estates and things. But what they do overseas is they will buy land at use value. So it might be agricultural land, it might be at industrial land that's low value. They will then commission a holistic master plan. And I say holistic because I mean that they really consider the needs of the community that they're trying to serve, of all shades and stripes and abilities, etc. And then they go ahead and again, retain control, but they act as developers. So they will say, okay, well here, builder X, go ahead and build me these particular set of houses that to the plan that we have developed. And so there's much more control over realizing the end results and making sure that the aims and the priorities of the planning policies are realized and they're actually serving the needs of their communities. And that's a model that I don't see why we can't use here in the UK. We have some forward-thinking councils who are acting as developers. We have councils that have quite a lot of estate land. Unfortunately, what's happening is that they are giving those over to developers to redevelop. The developers say, oh, I'm sorry, we can't possibly, one, do the amount of social housing that you had on the land previously. So they are actually losing social housing units and displacing residents that they had. And then they aren't gaining any new social housing for the long waiting lists that they already have. So we really do need to rethink the development model that we have and maybe focus more on providing agency. We have a history of Black-led social housing because the needs of Black communities simply are not being met in the conventional system. So there are housing associations that are building and providing, and the statistics sort of show, that they're actually helping people and they're expanding their reach to other ethnicities, to people with disabilities, really being very inclusive. So I know I've rambled on. If anyone else wants to add to that, hopefully I've answered your question, Idara. Thank you very much for asking it.
That is such a brilliant answer, and thank you very much for that. I don't know if any of the speakers would like to build up on that, but I would like to add or sort of to point out that when I first learned about all of London's housing problems and I started to read things like, oh, the word will come to me now. Anyway, about gentrification and development and regeneration, how all of those things seem to be so tied together. And up until now, and up until the way you've explained it now, I hadn't realised that actually regeneration and development don't necessarily need to lead to gentrification of an area if you do it well and if you have the right priorities and if you enable the right people to have agency and involve them in the process, that actually gentrification is completely avoidable and people don't need to be displaced unfairly. So thank you very much for that answer, honestly. Next, Christian Frost had raised his hand, and I'll.
Yeah, I did briefly raise it, but I think basically it's a fantastic. I was going to ask a question, but I think I'd rather Jake did, because I get to ask lots of questions in my life, and I think this is a fantastic student opportunity. So if I may defer, thank you for the opportunity, but thank and for setting up such a brilliant evening. But let's get some more students asking questions rather than old duffers like me.
Great. Well, in that case, we'll move over to Jake Cruz.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. So my question was, so all the initiatives and the projects that aim to create developments of comprehensive and diverse and diversity in terms of age, ethnicities, things like that, which is all great, and it's all done with the benefit of the inhabitants in mind. I just wondered how we prevent silos from forming. So in Cambridge, for example, they're trying to join various parts of the cities, so the housing sector of the cities and the jobs sector of the cities. So I just wondered how do we prevent silos from forming within these smaller developments and joining up in terms of London, the boroughs and wider areas.
Would any of the speakers like to pick up on that?
Sumita, would you want to go first? I'll follow.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I just wanted to add to the last question very quickly, was the difference between development and regeneration are actually in the word themselves. I feel that development often like, something like there's a forest and you come and chop the tree and you grow a new one there. And regeneration is a bit like coppicing, where actually you might cut the tree, but you get little trees forming around it. So there's regeneration available. So that's briefly my difference between development and regeneration. And the question about, how do we stop silos from forming? Now, that's really difficult, because I know that, for example, in the NHS, even though NHS might seem like one big organization, within it, there are so many different silos, and the new integrated issues that they're called integrated, but actually there are silos. So the way to overcome is to work together. And for instance, in my work, I've tried to integrate the finances with the workforce and then with the staff that are working there. So it's a very, very difficult thing to do, because if there is existing system which separates things and makes in silos, then you have to work really hard to actually change that system, and changing anything is quite difficult. So yes, that's what I would say very briefly.
Okay, I see David hasn't unmuted. David?
Yeah, I've just allowed myself to. So it's really interesting. I think, Jake, thank you for the question, Jake. I think in terms of, you're basically talking about creating ghettos, rich ghettos and poor ghettos. And in my experience, actually, that's a false question, because the beauty of London, one of the beauties of London is it's a really kind of intermingled, particularly it's an urban kind of centre. It's got this intermingled character. So you go from one street where there's an estate, and you go to another street where there's, really expensive houses, but then maybe the kids go to the same school. That's not an unusual thing in many parts of London. When I was a local authority housing officer, my experience on a specific estate, there's a sink estate, is of a people with particular background, crucially without the ability to kind of get up and move to somewhere else because they didn't have the financial resources. However, people understand this process of people moving to areas that are more interesting, that are more diverse, that are more kind of vibrant, and they have done for a long time. That people understand kind of areas that where you buy, if you bought a house in Hackney 50 years ago, you would have had no idea that it would suddenly become a massive kind of asset for you 50 years later, because there's a kind of a movement of people in many areas of London that has always been kind of comfortable living cheek by jowl with each other. And I think one of the it's not so much an issue of for me about silos, it's almost an issue about parallel lives. So we all acknowledge each other, because we all, we literally all kind of, well, we used to get on the bus together or get on the tube together. We used to kind of, being around each other. Anybody who lives in London is not ignorant of the fact that there are other people in London who both share the experience of being Londoners with them, but may come from a different background. That's not, that's not unusual or unexpected. The issue about that is that the institutions, I think, treat people in a different way. And this is the issue about the kind of structural biases that happen. So that you treat people in a different way, and then the outcomes end up as different. A thing that I used to talk about, there was a previous kind of, for me, meaning of the word gentrification, which has now been kind of superseded. So it's very clear now when we talk about gentrification that we're talking about a super aggressive kind of financial approach where the people that were there are kind of usurped in some way. However, there was an idea of gentrification where you draw people in with different backgrounds and different resources and different ways of life, and they contribute to the environment that you have, and everybody gets the benefit of people with different experiences. So that, as I was saying before, nobody has a monopoly of virtue, but everybody has the opportunity to kind of learn from each other. That is being superseded again by things like poor doors. That is being superseded again by situations where people with resources are able to kind of, even in terms of schools, and you know, where people send their schools and buying homes close to schools and the kids people can get their schools into, are being able to kind of tip the system. And that's a relatively recent thing. I was talking to a friend of mine recently who's kind of in arts and culture. We were talking about kind of what's the problem with, you know, how comes the BBC, for instance, is less diverse? And she said, it's because it's got posher. And I said, how is that the case? And she pointed out that in the, you know, after the Beveridge Report, after the Second World War, you had a lot of people going to university for the first time. So you had people from every background having an opportunity to contribute economically and intellectually. And they got into these positions. And actually what happened is they almost died out, or their kids or had a completely different experience. And now their kids who've had this different experience are now in those positions. So what you get is this kind of poshification of decision-making that is without, you know, that's not to kind of demean anybody, but it's just it's a kind of set of power. It's a kind of power dynamic that privileges one group and actually disproportionate, and then also this privileges one group. So you don't just kind of go in one direction at +5 for privilege, but you also go -5 for another privilege, and the overall gap is 10. So you get these kind of situations, these dynamics that are in there. And I think one of the things I try and talk about when I speak to the GLA, because I don't represent them, but I contribute to some of their conversations, is that these are the processes that are happening. The people best able to see that are from all sorts of backgrounds that are excluded. So apart from the fact that London is multiply diverse, London is at least 50% female. And if anybody on this call wants to tell me that as many women have the saying that the processes that define London as many men, then, you know, I'd kind of argue with that. So it's just about, for me, it's not necessarily the outcomes, it's really upstream. These are upstream decisions that are taken in rooms that are about kind of locking out enough people to have an influence on that conversation, to hold people to account. And that's what ends up with downstream situations that seem like they're silos and seem like they're ghettos of separate types of people. I hope that made some sort of sense.
Yeah, I think that's, sorry, I can.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good, David. And I think, you know, the part, how we do participation well and how we include people really is one of the questions that comes forward. And Jacqueline and I were speaking yesterday, and we were talking about how people know their area best. The people that, people know the area best, wherever that be. And there's a loss of knowledge when you have people from an area who have no say in the design of their cities. And we're seeing the consequence of that now in COVID, and we will continue to until we start to enable people from multi ethnicities, multi genders, just bringing people in that are currently not part of this conversation. And it's been really good to have this forum today, and I think these kind of forums need to keep going on, and that's something which we're, you know, really committed to as a society. And yeah, I think as we have overrun, I'm going to just kind of close out the evening and say a real thank you to everyone who has come tonight, and a real massive thank you to our speakers. So Jacqueline, Samita and David, it was really brilliant to hear your presentations, and thank you for your time this evening.